Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and around the world. Welcome to People's Republic. I, of course, am Brianna Griffith, and I would love to discuss for this week the Venezuelan elections that happened in 2020. A lot of really exciting updates as far as those elections in December and sort of the longer term political trajectory that Venezuela will likely be on given these elections. I would also like to kind of discuss sort of the of course media mythology, especially U.S. media mythology regarding the Venezuelan election, sort of the claims made by the remaining pro-Guaido camp, which at this point is essentially the U.S. And some, a handful of European countries. There are very few other countries that sort of recognize Guaido's leadership. And so I'd love to sort of dissect essentially what's said about the Venezuelan elections from that camp versus, the kind of reality from the many hundreds of independent election observers who are on the ground, who witnessed those Venezuelan elections, and sort of, what they saw and what essentially the results have shown about Venezuela as a democratic country. So to talk about all that, I am joined now by two wonderful guests. Jovanni Reyes is an organizer and member coordinator for the veterans-led anti-militarist organization About Face, Veterans Against the War. He's also a veteran of the NATO-led war in the former Yugoslavia, and he's of a Dominican and Puerto Rican background, holds a master's in international relations, and focuses on imperial politics in the global south. Jovanni, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me back.
Absolutely. And we are also joined by Monisha Rios. Monisha is a Puerto Rican veteran of the U.S. Army and a doctoral candidate in liberation psychology, investigating the global North's use of psychological warfare against the global South. She currently serves as co-coordinator of international relations for Vamos Puerto Rico, as president of Psychologists for Social Responsibility, and sits on the executive committee of the U.S. Peace Council. Joining us from Puerto Rico now is Monisha Rios. Thanks, Monisha, for coming in.
Hola, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so glad to be speaking with you both. Jovanni, at some point, I'd love to, in a future episode, love to sort of talk about, kind of your experiences in Yugoslavia, because I think people have forgotten so much of the kind of U.S. destruction, or the destruction that the U.S. caused, and having someone with a firsthand account would be so valuable. But for now, yeah, I'd love to sort of talk about, especially the Venezuelan elections. So Monisha, you were a delegate, essentially as an election observer in Venezuela at the time of the elections. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences?
Yeah, thanks. So I went, there were over 100 observers from a bunch of different organizations there, from a bunch of different countries. And when we got there, we were able to visit a lot of different sites before the elections, talk with the people who were in charge of each of those sites, the people from the communities that those sites were in, and see, from setup to the end of a voter's process, what it entails, and ask questions and really dissect how the process works there. And so we were able to see how the machines were set up, how they were tested initially before anyone would be allowed to vote, to make sure that they were functioning. We saw step by step what a voter would do. And then we got to learn how what are the catches to make sure that a person's vote is recorded properly. It was really interesting, especially because I not only was there to sort of see, what the actual truth is, but to also compare what their process is like, as opposed to what we've been going through in Puerto Rico with our recent elections as well. So I paid very close attention to how the people in the community, how they were empowered to to engage in truly participatory democracy in a protected way, like it's a sanctified event, right? So, for example, the protections that are in place for persons with disabilities or persons who may not have the best reading skills yet, to ensure that they get to participate without interference, as well as the ways that they make sure, like, for example, if a person accidentally votes against their will, like they pick someone they didn't intend to, and then the machine spits out a receipt and the receipt doesn't reflect their vote, they get to vote again. You know, that initial thing gets thrown out and then they get another try. And then the way that the people who are running the different sites are super helpful. Like they'll stay with a person until they're absolutely sure that they know how to use the machine and that the person tells them they're ready to vote, and then they step away. So there was so much that went on that we got to see, and I had some amazing conversations with the people who run the stations, like from the different communities, just on like what it means to them. And we got to talk with people from different parties, and each party has a witness in the room, you know. So it refuted the claims that we hear about all the time in Western media that there is not democracy in Venezuela and that the elections are fraudulent and that people are intimidated into voting a particular way. Like none of that was happening at all.
Yeah, I'm wondering what you've kind of heard about, essentially the opposition claims, and I say the opposition claims, the claims of certain far-right opposition members, such as Juan Guaido, Leopoldo Lopez, and other of these kind of essentially far right-wing figures, that essentially Venezuelan elections are rigged. To date, I can't really understand how it is they're claiming that these elections are rigged. We've heard this essentially in every election that the far right opposition loses. They claim are rigged. We also have that problem here in the United States, as we saw with Donald Trump. Any time you lose an election, you claim that it's rigged, etc. In fact, Donald Trump was even blaming somehow the long dead Hugo Chavez for somehow rigging the 2020 election. But I'm wondering kind of, if you've heard kind of any specifics regarding, again, these far right-wing opposition claims that the votes are rigged, and whether there's a kind of level of transparency that would refute essentially those claims.
Yeah. So it's important for folks to remember that there are two opposition camps, right? There's the Guaido opposition camp, which is the far right group that invited U.S. interventionism and tried to do a parliamentary coup and overthrow the government from the inside out. They, aside from these claims, they also, let's see, I'm checking my notes. They had set up from Coral Gables in Florida, set up like alternative government institutions as well to try to legitimize themselves, which is garbage. But so at the end of the day, there's other opposition, right, to the Bolivarian Revolution, to Chavismo, to PSUV as governed by Maduro. And those members of that opposition who are also against the Guaido opposition, they say themselves, and this is validated by press that was there. For example, Vijay Prashad, like you can go to Counterpunch and look at an article from December 14th that says even the opposition believes Venezuela's election was legitimate. So there are members of some of the older parties, Acción Democrática and COPE, from 1959 to 1999. And they were interviewed by Vijay Prashad, and they verified that no, anytime they want to verify whether the elections were bunk or not, like there's no evidence of fraud at any time. And another person that I talked to who was, he had run an election site in his community before, So he was very well versed on this, because I was really asking him a lot of deep stuff, like, so you in your role, what was your responsibility if someone, let's say an opposition party member who was observing, said something's wrong? How is that process carried out? How is it investigated? And then he said, in 20 years since Chavez came into power, and they expanded voting access, and they changed the way that voting takes place so that it is more participatory, they've never, ever, ever had fraud validated by any member of the normal opposition. So the claims that the Guaido opposition are making are totally, that's where the fraud is. That's where the fraud is. And like you said, like, that's part of the standard operating procedure for the United States and their regime change operations at home and abroad.
The Popular Will Party, which was responsible for the vast majority of the street violence, assassinations, lynchings, burnings of various kind of cars, buildings, the firebombing of a maternity hospital. This is the Popular Will Party. They're responsible for a massive amount of street violence, several years. But I remember this kind of most vividly. I was watching it most vividly in 2017 and part of 2018. That's the party that's made these kind of fraudulent, these claims of fraud. And so essentially they have been part of this kind of opposition that sat out of the elections. They've refused to participate because they know, essentially the real reason for it is they know how badly they would lose. Who would elect the people who had just firebombed a hospital to the halls of government? Who in their right mind, what population would vote for that into into the government? It's pretty horrifying stuff. But then of course there is kind of the vast majority of the opposition parties, kind of remnants of the various capitalist governments and sort of the capitalist coalitions that predate Chavismo. They largely don't have the kind of platform that Chavismo has brought. They have not been able to fulfill their social promises. I don't think people understand, for instance, the history of the Caracazo that happened in the early 90s and the kind of level of violence that essentially these kind of pre-Chavista parties were enabling through their economic policies, which essentially sent most of the wealth to the United States. So this is all kind of, I think, valuable historical context for why it is that essentially that why it is that the PSUV continues winning these elections in spite of the U.S. economic sanctions trying to destroy the economy, the U.S. economic sanctions that have killed tens of thousands of Venezuelans. So I'm wondering, from going back to the significance of these elections, though, the 2020 elections, I'm wondering, either from kind of an international standpoint or from a domestic policy standpoint, what sort of effects we can expect to see. First of all, from an international standpoint, I wonder, essentially this has eliminated Juan Guaido's claim to the quote unquote claim to the presidency, as flimsy as that was. Guaido was only head of the National Assembly because he was one of the people chosen at random to essentially be the symbolic figurehead of the National Assembly, which at the time he was the symbolic figurehead had no actual functional power within the Venezuelan government. And so he was essentially chosen at random to declare himself president. Well, now that his term is up within the National Assembly, his official quote unquote term is up. Now that essentially his party is completely out of power, the PSUV has swept into the National Assembly. What does that look like either for kind of international relations, and what does that look like for kind of what the Venezuelan government will be able to do domestically?
So one of the things that this allows and really empowers the Venezuelan government to do is to return to what they were trying to build with the people, for the people. So the Great Patriotic Pole that makes up the PSUV is comprised of people's movements, grassroots movements. And this is the mechanism by which that political power literally from the bottom up, the people who've been most exploited and harmed, by the capitalist governments that existed before, and that still try to block housing projects and try to return back to that profit before people mentality. Because, there's still, as we know about socialismo, it's a process, right? And so just because you win politically doesn't mean capitalism goes away in your society. It's a process. And so that process will be allowed to continue less hindered domestically. It will set up a better relationship between el pueblo and el gobierno. And internationally, I think putting that in the context of the recent coup reversal in Bolivia, and who knows what's going to happen in Ecuador tomorrow, I hope it will strengthen America Latina and the resistance to U.S. interventionism in the region. From the U.S., I think we can definitely expect more of the same attempts of interventionism and domination.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. And of course, Biden was very quick to jump on recognizing Juan Guaido as the quote unquote president. When we saw one of Donald Trump's last State of the Union addresses, we saw all of the Democratic figureheads, all of the Democratic leaders in Congress applaud so heartily for Juan Guaido being president at Donald Trump's State of the Union. So we're essentially seeing this bipartisan foreign policy that is very, very similar in many ways to the Trump administration himself. For a president who essentially was promising publicly that he was not going to be Donald Trump, he is certainly very much ruling in many ways on foreign policy and domestic policy like Donald Trump. But yeah, I'm wondering, I haven't heard from you, Jovanni. Do you have anything you'd like to sort of add on to regarding either the elections, regarding sort of the changes we can expect out of 2020?
Yeah. So a couple of things need to be clear right now. A couple of things needed to be, known, right? If we're talking about Venezuela, any other Cuba, any other countries, right? So we got to see this from the perspective of that the United States is an empire in decline right now. It's being challenged by many fronts, domestically and internationally, right? And the threat that Venezuela poses to American hegemony in Latin America it's different than what Cuba posed back in 1960, right? So if you recall, Cuba was pretty much the first country that was sanctioned by executive order, right? Or in Eisenhower, and then JFK embargoed it, and then during the Clinton era, it became law. It became law. Sanctions against Cuba became law with the Burton-Helms Act, right? So, but Venezuela possesses a different threat to U.S. hegemony in Latin America than what Cuba poses, because Venezuela has the economic capacity, the economic power to influence the region away from U.S. dominance. Through Venezuela has the largest known oil reserve in the world. One of the first things that Chavez did when he came to power, particularly and especially after the coup, was to nationalize the Venezuelan oil, which pretty much ExxonMobil and other petroleum companies pretty much had dominance on Venezuelan oil, and Chavez nationalized it, right? Another thing that happened in the revolution, right, in the Bolivarian Revolution is, right, that the concept of democracy is being applied in Venezuela is different than the American concept of democracy. The American concept of democracy is, right, every 4 years you just go vote. That's it. Most people don't really have a say in the decisions of government. And people feel it. People feel that they really don't have a say in what happens. However, in Venezuela, the concept of democracy that Chavez introduced was what they call protagonismo, right? What they call is, the protagonist concept of democracy. It's a participatory democracy. It's where pretty much communities organize themselves, right? And then they make demands, and they made demands to the government, and then they enacted it. Pretty much ran the community, you know. So it was more of a direct form of democracy. It was more a participatory democracy, which trend pretty much it leads all over the region. That's why you get the reaction you got from Colombia. That's why you get the reaction you got from from Peru, from other countries in the region. And with Chavez's example, also with the Bolivarian Revolution example, where other countries in the region started also, leftist governments started winning in Brazil and in Paraguay and Uruguay and Ecuador, and what was called back in the early 2000s the pink tide, So what the Bolivarian project was promoting, right, was this type of regional integration in South America, right? So it was the first time ever in 500 years of history and in Latin America that we have a block of leftist or progressive or Latin American countries coming together, right, and working on a project of integration. Because before, what was happening before, the number one client of Venezuela was the United States. The number one client of Peru was the United States. The number one client of Colombia was the United States. The number one client of Brazil was the United States. So they weren't really integrated. Their economies, their politics were really integrated with each other. And one of the things that the Bolivarian Project was promoting is the regional integration, And with that, right, there were organizations that was being created, like the CELAC. The CELAC means the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, right, which was a type of UN for Latin America, right, was supposed to supplant the OAS, which is the Organization of American States, with headquarters in New York, that pretty much the United States dominate, right? The CELAC was supposed to supplant that, and it was an organization, right, that opened membership to all Latin America, all American countries, minus the United States and Canada. So it left out United States and Canada, but pretty much opened up to all countries in the Western Hemisphere. Another organization that was created under, under Chavez leadership was the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, right, which is called ALBA. That was another organization, that was created under Chavez. You have also Petrocaribe, right, which is the project of subsidized oil, Venezuelan oil to Caribbean countries. You have the UNASUR, which is the United in the South, right? Also, one of the things that one of the projects that Chavez was working on was the common currency of the South, right? And that was to get the South American countries away from the dollar, right, to do business with each other. Because right now, what's happening with the dollar is the currency, the global currency where countries do business with each other. So with the dollar, that's how U.S. have power over other countries, because U.S. can just pretty much deny dollars to other people, right? Because the only country that prints dollar is the United States. So when countries have to do business with each other with dollars, right, that pretty much puts them at a disadvantage, right? With the common currency of the South, the idea was to have South American countries do business with each other with the common currency that they created, if that makes sense, right? So all those projects that was happening was creating a real threat to U.S. dominance in Latin America, which pretty much goes back to 1823 with the Monroe Doctrine, and also one of the things that Chavez did was, he revigorized the OPEC, which is a cartel, the oil petroleum, cartel, global cartel, right? And they set the oil prices and all that, from countries that produces oil, right? Before they were selling undervalued. They were selling oil at undervalued, right? One of the things that Chavez did, right? And I was in Saudi Arabia when that was happening, was that was trying to get all these oil producing countries, to pretty much set the price, not overprice each other or underprice each other, just set it pretty much a standard price. And that helped bring up the oil price, the global oil price, to about $150 a barrel. And that brought a lot of revenue to the oil producing countries, right? Venezuela, benefited from that, and so did Dubai, the UAE, all these other countries, benefited from, Nigeria is another one that benefited from the high oil prices, right? So it's one of the things that the Chavez leadership did. Another thing that he was promoting was the South to South relations. What does that mean? That means that Venezuela should have relationship directly with South Africa, for example, or should have relationship directly with Iran, for example. We should have direct relations directly with Zimbabwe or North Korea without going through the United States or European countries. That's how, and what they were doing is they were pretty much, asserting Venezuelan independence, and they were asserting Venezuelan sovereignty. Meaning that they can have relationships with any government that they please, that pretty much they were looking out for those self-interests. Right now, what you have is a lot of countries, and before that, what you have a lot of countries in Latin America, they were pretty much following the cue of the United States. So if the United States didn't want to do business with Cuba, for example, no other countries in Latin America did business with Cuba because the United States said so. If the United States doesn't want to do business with North Korea, no other countries in Latin America should do business with North Korea because the United States said so, right? So what Chavez was doing is, no, we're a sovereign country, we're an independent country, and we should be able to have a relationship with any other country we please. So that's why he was also promoting South to South relations, right? So all that put together, right, made Venezuela a higher threat than what Cuba ever posed to the United States imperialism in Latin America, right? And that's why you see U.S. power, going so hard on Venezuela right now. That's why you see the sanctions going on right now in Venezuela, right? I mean, they're like crippling sanctions, right? A UN rapporteur went down to visit Venezuela, right? And he described it as a medieval what's the word he used? Siege, a medieval siege, right, on the country. They're denied when COVID hit. They were denied PPE. They're an oil-producing country, but because they're denied parts for refineries, they're denied to refine their oil in other countries and whatnot. They pretty much can't produce. So now there's an oil shortage in Venezuela, right? Denying them, any type of, blocking what's called secondary sanctions, meaning that any country that does business with Venezuela today, right, runs the risk of being sanctioned by the United States. So what's happening, right? So Venezuela is pretty much economically isolated, right? So what you have is an economic warfare, right? And that's how you want, in any type of critique, any type of analysis of Venezuela, should always start with Venezuela today is in a state of war, right? And in 2000, there was a study done from 2000, from 2017 to 2018, 40,000 Venezuelans died as a result of the embargo or the economic coercion that the United States is running, right? So whenever 40,000 people die of any country, right, because of the hostilities of another country, right, that's war, and that should be seen as war. And any critique or any analysis should always start with Venezuela is in a state of war. That's what they are. Another factor with what's happening in Venezuela is, right, the South Florida complex, right, which is the South Florida. Florida is an important state for U.S. elections, right? So a lot of politicians, whether they be Republicans and Democrats, right, they want to cater to the South Florida residents, right, because they hold a lot of power in elections, particularly presidential elections, right? So you see this being a bipartisan thing. Aggression towards Venezuela is bipartisan because you see these candidates want to cater to the South Florida complex, which is pretty much is a hive of embittered Latin American reactionaries, right-wing reactionaries, right? Starting off with the embittered Cuban elite that left Cuba in 1959 and settled in Florida. And then now you're seeing, with the Sandinista winning in Nicaragua, you see a lot of, embittered Latin America or embittered Nicaraguans, reactionaries moving to South Florida. You're seeing now you're seeing Venezuelans now. So all these people, they're all pretty much together in this one area, right? And they hold a lot of sway in U.S. elections. So that's another reason why the United States is pretty much, enacting this criminal embargo on Venezuela today.
Yeah, there's so much I'd love to discuss there in the second half. I think that's a great kind of overview of a lot of different very important subjects for people to understand. I just want to cut to a break real quick and just remind people that you are listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. Stay tuned for the second half of our discussion with Jovanni Reyes and Monisha Rios in just a minute. All right, welcome back to People's Republic. This is, of course, Brianna Griffith, and we're going to pick up pretty much right where we left off with our discussion with Jovanni Reyes and Monisha Rios about, I think we had left off with sort of the sanctions against Venezuela, as well as sort of the communities within South Florida. A lot of interesting points I'd love to pick up on there. The South Florida thing was interesting because, as you said, there are a lot of kind of rich right-wing Cubans, essentially the remnants of the Batista dictatorship and the former ruling class, kind of settled in much of South Florida. And I think it's interesting that if you look at the numbers in the 2020 election, Joe Biden actually received less, again, if we look at the quote unquote Latino vote within the US, Biden actually received a far less percentage of people who self-identified as quote unquote Hispanic in much of the country, including in the Rio Grande Valley. Biden won less of a percentage of people within that area, which I would say is kind of very representative of kind of the U.S. Mexican and Mexican American population. The terms of raw percentage, he almost barely won a majority of those votes over Trump compared to Clinton, who won a much greater percentage in 2016. So Biden, in many ways, was very, very close to, again, quote unquote, losing the Latino vote. The quote unquote Latino vote that the U.S. media always likes to talk about, as though, again, like there aren't a whole lot of conflations going into that. But if I talked about this on some other shows I was on, some friends shows and whatnot. And if you look at the campaigning that Biden was doing, Biden was campaigning primarily to quote unquote win the Latino vote. He was talking primarily to issues and campaigning primarily in South Florida to win over essentially far right wing Miami Republicans who had already decided to, many of them were already like hardcore Trump voters, and that's who it is he was trying to win over, rather than the many, many more kind of working class Central Americans, Mexicans, Mexican Americans who constitute a larger percentage of the voting population, first of all, but then who represent kind of issues that many more Americans are concerned with. Like, he essentially wasn't going for the working class, again, like quote unquote Latino vote within the US in many ways. And so that's one of the many kind of reasons it was so close. If it hadn't been for COVID, Trump, I think, would have absolutely won, as much as some people might hate to hear that. But yeah, that sort of obsession with that particular subset of the quote unquote Latino population within the U.S. Biden was also campaigning with Ana Navarro as one of his major campaign managers for Latino outreach. She openly kind of boasts of her connections to the Nicaraguan Contras, the death squads in Nicaragua. So that's who it is who has won the presidency now, is people who essentially campaigned with affiliates of Nicaraguan death squads. I don't think that can be said any clearer. But I'd like to turn to this question of sanctions as well. As a form of economic warfare. As I'll always point out, sanctions, unilateral sanctions like the ones that the U.S. has undertaken in the United States, they are legal under international law. They are not legal under international law. They are, in fact, an act of economic warfare. They target primarily the civilian population. And the idea is that they're always supposed to be used as leverage, quote unquote leverage, the fact that, again, tens of thousands of human lives or sometimes millions of human lives in countries like Iran over the course of a much longer period of time. These lives are essentially used by the U.S. as leverage to encourage these countries or to force these countries into essentially privatizing, like undoing all of their nationalization, and essentially allowing, again, U.S. oil companies and other U.S. Corporations to come in and control the economies of these countries. Once again, however, it seems like I'd say a lot of the kind of economic situation to some degree is changing, that U.S. sanctions are no longer, I mean, they're certainly destructive. I never want to minimize the power of U.S. sanctions. But with China and with other countries, both regional players and global players such as Iran, Russia, Venezuela, with these countries being able to sort of come into their own economically, while the U.S. was so bogged down in these the forever, quote unquote, forever wars in the Middle East, these countries have essentially entered into to some degree a sort of economic alliance of convenience, or maybe alliance is the wrong word, but essentially a cooperative pact by which they can develop their economies independent of U.S. interference. A lot of that has also required a kind of military or a certain kind of paramilitary component, because the U.S. is also looking at those options as well, simply overthrowing the government by force, but it doesn't seem that is likely in a country like Venezuela. Anyway, I'm wondering kind of where that stands, like where sort of U.S. sanctions are standing to this day, and how Venezuela is trying to overcome those in various ways.
Yeah. So right now, the United States is pretty much sanctioning like 1/3 of the global population, right? So yeah, I mean, it's crazy, and that's pretty much, and that's pretty much evident. That's pretty much evident that U.S. soft power is not working. U.S. soft power is not working, and that further evidence that U.S. power is declining in the world, because they have to resort to force. They just can't influence people through goodwill. They have to resort to force, and like you said, sanction is a form of force. Like we know, just give you an example. When COVID hit, right? When COVID hit, in the Wuhan province in China, and then moved to Italy, and then and around that same time, right, moved into Iran, and Iran had been sanctioned since 1979, and what the Trump administration did, when Iranians started being, when the body count started growing in Iran, it started rising and the infection rates started rising. What did the Trump administration do? They doubled down on sanctions. Like, it's almost like they wanted the Iranians to die. They wanted Iranians to die, right? And the idea is, right, to punish the population and make the population so miserable, right, that they have no other recourse but to revolt against the government, right, to ease the pain. And that's what it is, putting pain on the population so they can revolt against the government that you don't like. And like you said, that's totally illegal. That's collective punishment. So you're punishing the whole population, right, because you don't like that particular government, right? So you have governments like Zimbabwe. It's like I said, 1/3 of the population is being sanctions today, right? And like I said earlier, Cuba was the first country to be sanctioned by executive order, in 1959, 1960, right? Um, in the last 30 years at the UN, almost unanimously, right, they have been voting to lift sanctions in Cuba. Almost, for the last 30 years, right, the majority of the countries, minus like 3 countries, has voted year after year that the sanctions on Cuba are illegal and the United States should lift sanctions on Cuba, right? And the United States continue to ignore that, right? Only 3 countries, side go against that, right? Which one is Israel, and the one is like Palau, and the other one is another, I think it was Colombia, something like that, right? But yeah, so that's telling you that the world is not, it's against us, right? But the United States still hold the world's largest military industrial, machine in the world. United States military, occupy, has about 1,000 bases around the world. United States, the world still functions with the dollar. It's the world currency. So that provides a lot of leverage and power. But if you go back to the Guaido effect, for example, when in 2019, when Trump, pretty much decided who's going to be the president of Venezuela, and just pick this obscure person, and this person took the oath of presidency like in a public plaza and whatnot, right? That same year, 50 countries, sided with the United States. Most of them were European countries, and some of them were, right-wing Latin American countries, right, that recognized Guaido as a president, creating this parallel government. But that same year, Venezuela was host to the Nine Aligned movement, right, which is an organization of 123 countries. 123 countries, members from 123 countries, represented from 123 countries. That same year that the United States recognized Guaido as president, met in Venezuela and they had a conference there, right? So what does that tell you? So 50 states recognized Guaido, but 123 recognized Maduro, right? So, right there is telling you that the world is not, it's pretty much against U.S. policy, with this, right? And it's evident, and right now, like you mentioned China, you mentioned Russia, right now, with its forever wars, it's seemed more and more evident that we're moving from a unipolar world into a multipolar world, and honestly, right, people should welcome that. People should welcome that because with a multipolar world, you set limits in U.S. power, around the world.
You can only sanction people, like you can only make that threat. We're not going to trade with you if you trade with this third country. Like, we're not going to trade with you if you trade with Venezuela. You can only make that threat if you're a country that people want to trade with. If you're a country that other countries want to trade with. Increasingly, the U.S. is no longer the economically dominant force. The U.S. is not a country that holds that same level of sway, I don't think, as these other countries develop economically. And yeah, as you said, that should be something that anyone looking at this should absolutely welcome. That should be something that should be greeted with an absolute celebration, because the U.S. unipolar world, the world in which the U.S. was the quote unquote world policeman, was the most destructive point on the planet in world history. No other world power has been as destructive as the U.S. was in its era of unipolar dominance. Anyway, Monisha, is there anything you'd like to sort of add? Or are there other kind of things you'd like to bring up? I know we've been talking with Jovanni quite a bit.
Thanks. So I think one of the things that I as I've been listening to you both, that really hit home for me was the class war that's happening, the global class war that we can see playing out in Venezuela. I mean, when we look at the history of the United States, why the empire formed to begin with, what the impact of that was on indigenous peoples, how it needs to advance and continue consuming indigenous lands and everywhere pretty much, in order to self-perpetuate and survive. And especially when you were talking about the right-wing remnants in Cuba, I mean, in Florida, from Cuba, from everywhere that the U.S. has its claws in, in Latin America. I think the significant threat that Venezuela poses not only to the US, but to the ruling elite in the world is that it exemplifies that participatory democracy. It's not so much Maduro that's the threat. It's not the PSUV that's the threat. It's the people power that's the threat. It's the will of the people actually being exercised in their own interests. It's the presence of indigeneity in political and powerful spaces, like in Bolivia as a plurinational state. And Venezuela's moved toward that direction with now there's 3 permanent seats for indigenous peoples in the National Assembly. That's another really important fact to remember about this particular National Assembly election. Nick Estes was also there as an observer, and the Red Nation has a podcast that they did that talked about that. It's dated December 23rd, and it's called Venezuela, Sanctions and Democracy. And he gets into that, and the other guests on there get into that as well. And so when we take like a look through a class analysis lens and think about transnational solidarity, and why it's important that we support the left in Latin America, because they're closest to the United States. So I feel like another reason why the US, being the geopolitical power that it is now, is so threatened by them is because of their location, because they could actually stop the US, you know? And if the Gran Colombia, that was Bolivar's vision, were able to take shape, then that would be a huge threat to US rule. And it would be a huge threat to the global elite. Well, you have a much stronger presence of socialism, a much stronger presence of what socialism actually is and what it's meant to be, which is the power of the people, right? The protagonism that Jovanni mentioned before. So for me, that's what really comes through. And that's one of the reasons why I said yes the instant I was asked to go and observe, is to not only be a witness and to not only try to help counter the psychological warfare and the psyops that are going on that not only undermine the democracy for Venezuelans, but undermine all of our lives, really, and convince people in the US and in the global north that these policies, these illegal policies, are justified. But also to connect with that real direct democracy, and to see it in action and to be inspired by it. And that's the other threat too, is Venezuela, just like Cuba, is inspiring to people to see actual power in the people's hands taking shape and being used to further the interests of El Pueblo. You know, like, why is nationalizing resources such a threat to capital? Why is it that indigenous power is such a threat to capital? You know, and it's because they lose control over the resources. And the people get to advance themselves and they get to say no. So that's what really is driven home to me in this conversation, and listening to you both, and then reflecting on my experience there. And then also recalling, like, what's our responsibility, socialists, with regard to Venezuela and with regard to the popular power that is happening there, regardless of the internal tensions that exist, you know, as are going to exist in any country that is in transition away from capitalism, right? So regardless of that, we have a responsibility to be in solidarity and to make sure that our lens on the activities that take place in the global South are not viewed through the first world lens. So that's another thing that really impresses me about how democracy is practiced and protected and defended by the people in Venezuela. Because we can talk about the government, and that still is like not really touching on the heart of what democracy in Venezuela actually is. And it is the power of the people in action. That's why it needs to be protected. And that's why our solidarity is so important. It's not with Maduro. Like, that's that first world lie. It's with the people of Venezuela. So.
Yeah, I think the U.S. and U.S. media is always kind of projecting its own cults of personality onto the leaders of other countries, whether that's this obsession with Maduro being like the entirety of the Venezuelan government. I mean, if there's a country whose leaders are cults of personality, I can't imagine a country whose leaders are more kind of cults of personality than the United States itself. Whether that's the cult of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the cult of Obama, the cult of Trump, you can go on down the line there. But I think that is such an important point, and I've kind of found myself like more, especially kind of since COVID, really trying to find many silver linings and trying to sort of imagine and show people what alternatives will look like. George Chicharello Mar has an interesting book about Venezuela. It's from, I believe, the mid 2010s or so, I think circa 2014, called Building the Commune. It's a short book. It's a short read. I definitely think it's worth its own discussion for sure. And it's very accessible, and it goes into what exactly the Venezuelan democratic system looks like, not just in the government, not just when you go and vote, because that's the only democracy that the US is obsessed with, is whether people go out and vote every 2 years, every 4 years. For a country like Venezuela, for a country like Cuba, what democracy means is, above all things, it's democracy in the workplace. It is to say that you and your coworkers, the people who are the workers in the workplace, they're the runners of the factory, or they're the people who control the media station, whatnot. Those people get to kind of come together, or and sort of decide for themselves, what is it we need to produce, how much of something we need to produce, how do we want to really divvy up this kind of system, how do we want to sort of democratically run our workplace without the need for essentially the dictatorial system. Because what does it mean to have a democracy in government if your workplace and your apartment complex, like everything that you need to survive and the place where you spend most of your day, are dictatorships run by someone who collects all of the money that you make for that company? Same thing with regard to this communist system. There are also these kind of apartment communes. That is to say, like, you and your fellow tenants are within kind of an organized tenant union, and these tenant unions have sort of open recognition and support of the government, rather than the U.S. government, which fights unions at every step of the way. Republican or Democrat, our government is incredibly anti-union, but instead, these unions, both within the workplace and within apartment, within like housing, are allowed to flourish. That's what the commune system is, and that's what democracy looks like. I'm wondering how much you've kind of seen of that, and what sort of kind of Venezuelan democracy would look like, or what this kind of system would look like if we were to be able to implement that.
Yeah, actually, I did get the joy of visiting one of the communities that you're talking about, Kaikashi, and they just blew my mind. We got to see that there was this abandoned complex, right? This abandoned set of buildings from that a business has had that left Venezuela, and these people, they petitioned the Chavez government. They said, "We want this land. We want these buildings because we need a safe place to live, right? We want this for us to build a community." And they did it. And they have, it's beautiful. And they have created centers for the kids to be able to study and have access to computer and internet. They have each person, they have roles in the community that they decide on who does what democratically. It really is the living manifestation of the to each according to their ability, to each according to their need. And what's incredible too is that in this community, one of the community leaders ran for a seat in the National Assembly and won under the PSUV, the PSUV. So that's the other significance of the Great Patriotic Poll that people need to really connect with, is that it is an avenue by which communities have direct access to form policies that directly impact their lives in their communities, right? So it was incredible. I want to go back actually and spend more time in all of these different communes, because there's so many different ones outside of Caracas as well. And she did win the seat, by the way. The community leader did win. So that's phenomenal. And I got emotional when I was there too, because where I live in Vieques, Puerto Rico, we don't have a hospital still.
This was, of course, a really great conversation. I'm glad we got to spend the full hour talking about all of these issues, all these very important issues. So we were joined by for this entire episode by Jovanni Reyes, who's an organizer and a member coordinator for the veterans-led anti-militarist organization About Face. And we were also joined by Monisha Rios, who currently serves as the co-coordinator of international relations for Vamos Puerto Rico, as well as many other roles and titles there that I know they both wear. Thank you both so much for coming on, and hope to have you on soon. That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 New Orleans. We are available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. Thanks for tuning in as we report from the front lines of the struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here.